Hello, my name is Tiffany Galvin Green. I'm the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at John Carroll University.
And hi, I'm Megan Wilson Wrights. I'm also at John Carroll University, where I serve as the Administrative Coordinator for Diversity and Equity.
So we're here to introduce a new perspective for approaching anti-racism work entitled Plant a Justice Tree for Anti-Racism Work. And in this framework, we want to introduce to you a model for thinking about how to tackle racism with three different stages in mind. So we approached this and came to this particular idea after talking with colleagues, friends, and students and doing various workshops where we constantly hear a question of, well, I want to help promote racial equity, but where do I start? So in these conversations, we are increasingly aware of what's going on in society, a lot of attention to injustices going on, a lot of attention to what we should and should not say, how can we become more involved? And it's largely been this question of, well, where do I plant myself in these conversations? So with that in mind, we started to not just present the material, but think about, well, how do others approach this work, or how do others provide guidance for becoming more anti-racist or becoming more involved in racial equity work? And a lot of the scholars that have written around this area suggest much more of a linear framework, where the models will look something like this, where you are somewhere in a comfort zone that you need to break out of. You need to educate yourself so that you can learn to ask yourself different questions, maybe get out of a zone of being in denial or being defensive, and really start to engage more in asking different questions. And as you learn more, you move from this comfort zone to this learning zone where you're more open about your vulnerability, more open about areas that you need to acquire new knowledge about, asking your question, moving from sort of I don't see racism to I now understand racism as a problem. And then you sort of, as you gain more knowledge, you're ready to be in that sort of growth zone where you're more aware and you're out trying to actively engage in the community and do things. But the problem with these kinds of models or this approach is that it's often very linear, as if you move from one stage very nicely into the other. As you acquire more knowledge, as you acquire more information, as you do more reading, perhaps a little bit of engagement, you move to more growth and you're ready to become active and involved. But in reality, life is not that linear, and the learning stage is actually much more constant and cyclical as opposed to step by step. Oftentimes, what's needed is that you have to go through several rounds of moving out of denial, and several rounds of, even if you are engaging in more learning and if you are becoming more educated, you still have to break out of some norms and your own behaviors. You need to have some uncomfortable conversations. You need to be involved in some interactions before you're really truly ready to engage in doing some work, even before you're ready to engage others in conversation and what they may do to become more involved. So instead of thinking about becoming an anti-racist as a new identity that you can take on with new knowledge, we started really grappling with, well, what do you need to do to think about it more as a cyclical process that you evolve through over time? So that's where we came to this idea of tackling racism as a three-pronged approach through education, engagement, and then going to affect change. So we propose a more organic model, the justice tree. And the three E's in there are for educate, engage, and effect. And they operate not mechanistically as in a one-way train, but rather more organically, cyclical, and characterized by constant growth and a process that's ever evolving, much like the stages where we're of development from an acorn to a tree.
And the work of learning about and working towards racial equity has to start really small. And we have to understand that it takes time. It's especially true for white folks, whose development in this area is often a little delayed and stunted by growing up in a society that norms and centers whiteness. And so when we think about how we get to effectiveness, how do we affect change, we start by thinking about where we're each starting. So I think of it like this. Inside each of us are the seeds of a more just world. But in order to grow, those seeds have to expand beyond themselves. So just like an acorn has to absorb water and warmth in order to sprout, we have to start absorbing different messages about the world than the ones we might have grown up with. And in our really, really racialized culture, racism is everywhere. And so a lot of us have been encased in this really hard shell, just like an acorn, of racist assumptions without ever realizing that those systems are informing who we are. And so we have to be intentional about absorbing the things around us that'll help us break out of that shell. And so once an acorn cracks open, it's not yet a tree, right? So once it sprouts, it needs water, it needs sunlight, it needs soil and air, it needs to all those things in order to grow. And so like us, we also have to start breaking out of that racism that keeps us trapped by engaging with the things that help us to grow. So our self-development relies on others. And so in this next stage, the engage stage, it's hard. We're fragile, right? But growth requires that we keep at it, that we show up as our full and vulnerable selves in multiracial communities, and that we work to be a full participant in those dialogues and in those relationships. Eventually, with time and with nurture, that little sprout becomes a tree. Yes, it can stand on its own. It can offer shade to others. But as we'll see in the next slides, trees don't stop growing once they mature. So they keep adding to themselves. They add more rings. They put down deeper roots. They support their whole ecosystem, right? What we know about trees is that they actually support the whole system around them and that they facilitate growth for other trees around them. And so for those of us who are people of faith and those of us who are working in Ignatian ministries and institutions, this may be particularly something that we notice because the model also resonates with our own spiritual journey and the work of the charism of our institutions. And this is as it should be, because the work isn't simply intellectual, right? It's soul work, it's heart work, it's body work. We have to put our whole selves into this work. And so, like other Jesuit schools, John Carroll University is rooted in the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm. And so this will be familiar for some of you. It prioritizes the education of the whole person, mind, body, spirit. And it prioritizes the education of the other as other directed, right, for the sake of the community and the sake of the world. And this model also informs our development of the justice tree model. So unlike banking models of education, where the job of the learner is to just receive information and store it up passively until they're full, the Ignatian model, of course, implies that education is dynamic. It's a cyclical process where you absorb information in order to give context to a concrete experience, and then you reflect on that experience in order to take action. Then you evaluate that action, identifying where next to seek out context, which is then used to inform the next set of experiences, reflection, action, and onward through the cycle.
So the first stage of this model is the educate yourself first, or the acorn phase. So what's important to recognize there is first you have to approach what you learn, read, listen to, and watch with a growth mindset. So a growth mindset is the difference between trying versus a fixed mindset. Is a fixed mindset often assumes that you've reached the capacity that you can reach in any particular knowledge set. And that means that you'll be defensive. If something doesn't match your experiences or what has been your education thus far, you may be more resistant to getting in the lessons. And as opposed to a growth mindset, is that you have to be open to becoming better and recognizing that there's always more to learn. So that even though you may be knowledgeable in certain areas or knowledgeable in certain topics, that doesn't mean that there isn't more to learn or a different perspective to be gained. And at this very early stage, it's really important that you don't get stuck in your own ideas of yourself, particularly as talked about by Dali Chug, the scholar from NYU, is that you don't want to get caught into thinking of yourself as a good versus a bad person. You want to think of yourself as being more good-ish, that you have the opportunity to always become better, that it's not that you either know or you didn't know, that you're a racist or an anti-racist, that you actually, have to do things to make yourself more and more racially informed or informed about other identities in general. The second point to think about is that lived experience is important, but lived experience is not the same as education. So it's important to seek an understanding if these are not experiences that you've had personally, then you need to center the lived experiences and voices of people of color or other identities that have been marginalized so that you can understand what's of central importance to them so that you can have more of a centered understanding of the work and what some of the issues are. Yet, you can't overassume that the few lived experiences that you may encounter represent all of the experience of those that have been marginalized or mistreated in the system. And at the same time, if you're someone who's actually lived through and had racial injustice experiences yourself, you can't also assume that your set of experiences is all that you need for education. There's a variety of experiences that need to be explored of different cultures, different understandings of histories. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of self-reflection and self-education. So examining one's lived experiences and others through the lens of histories and policies, practices, institutions, and data, or identifying patterns and systems at work is what's important, that it's a lot more complicated than just talking to a few people or having a few experiences.
And of course, it also means taking responsibility for your own education. So you have to do your research on the issues that you're not familiar with. And it's important that we're careful not to assume that it's up to other people to educate us. So whether that means going and finding some books and reading about other people's experiences or watching documentaries or doing the research yourself. But when other people do help you on your journey to self-education, whether through their own work or through their writing, or as generous friends who've had the lived experience and are sharing that with you, give them loud and enthusiastic appreciation and give them credit. And also, if they're doing the work, pay them, because just because you are new to the conversation doesn't mean that it's a new conversation. And it's important that we, when we're doing this work of educating ourselves, that we understand that we're plugging into a whole network of experiences and to do that work ourselves.
As we move into the next stage, the engaging stage, then this is really about getting prepared to have tough and authentic conversations. And these are not going to be easy or quick. And very often than not, they're going to be exhausting. But at the end of the day, they're worth it because primarily you need to stay focused on your purpose and remember your goals. So engaging in authentic conversations is really about sort of understanding and asking for, being open to oops and ouch moments that will occur, understanding that there needs to be a little bit of grace when mistakes happen. So when starting on the path of interpersonal engagement and these very difficult touchy issues, and these are things that are filled with emotion no matter where you stand in the set of experiences, understand that mess ups will happen, that people will say the wrong thing or be overly sensitive in how they receive things, and that you may say the wrong thing and which is an oops, and may cause unintentional harm, which is an ouch. And those things happen. And when that inevitably happens, it's okay to apologize, and it's even more important to forgive. And you don't want to let these ouches keep you from continuing to do the work. Secondly, we want to look at sort of when to call out and when to call in. So know when it's time to call someone out, when it's time, if you observe a behavior or problem behavior from others, such as racist speech or actions, microaggressions, to more overt actions, it's important to know when you need to stand up and call out and make it clear that that kind of behavior is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. But then there are other times when you're really trying to engage in conversation, and it may not be the time to call out someone as much as you want to seize the opportunity to explore. So why do you think that way? Where did that particular assumption come from? Can I share a different experience with you? Look for opportunities to make meaning together and seek mutual understanding across differences, as opposed to everything being understand when to call out versus when to call in.
It's also a good time to listen without defensiveness. And, I say that as someone who grew up in the dominant culture and has had to learn, sometimes through some very hard lessons, that I don't know what I don't know. And so when we first start learning about issues of racial equity, there can be moments, especially for white identified folks, to hear about other people's experiences and to feel defensive, right? That when we start hearing about things like white privilege, or any of these concepts that are sometimes new to us, that we can get on the defensive pretty quickly. This is not a good time to do that, right? We cannot engage authentic relationship if we have walls up, and the walls have to come down in order for us to grow. So that is really important. And when engaging on difficult issues, you've got to listen more than you speak. Especially in this stage, listen to the arguments being made by others. Listen to understand first, not to respond. Listen with curiosity. Listen to identify the sources of misunderstanding. And then once you have done that, you also have this experience of engaging with the work in these relationships, and we have to be really careful not to engage in the work as a gift to others. So sometimes I say we again, white identified folks, have a habit of wanting to collect trophies for doing this work. So we don't get rewards for showing up for the work of justice. Nobody hovers over each acorn to celebrate the moment it decides to crack open. It's the job of a sapling to grow into a tree, and the forest requires it. Our work for justice is not a gift we're giving to others, but it's our work of growing into our whole selves and growing into the selves our community needs us to be.
So in the last phase, we have how then you move from effecting transformative change, or you move to effecting transformative change. So you've done some of the hard work of cracking out of that acorn. You're engaging in authentic conversations and authentic relationships. And then it's time to, one, find your unique place in the ecosystem. So just as a forest is characterized by the many interconnected species that create a system and balance, we can think of work for social justice as being characterized the same way. So Deepa Iyer provides a instructive model that talks about just understanding that we all held different particular roles in the work of social change. Some of us are there as strong supporters. Some of us are there to be a resource. Others are more frontline, maybe involved in activism, protest, movement changes, etc. Others of us need to be a voice, a champion, maybe more back end. Whatever the particular dynamic is in our lives and as part of movements and organizations, there's many different roles that we can play in the pursuit of equity. And so it's okay to acknowledge that you don't need to be a part of every different type of role to be active in making change and promoting social change. Secondly, leverage your power, privilege, and access. So just like a strong tree can provide shelter and shade for many others, recognize that you have personal sources of power yourself. So where and with whom you have influence, look for those opportunities. If you are an influential person in your social circles, in your family, then those are great places that small changes that you are making in your behaviors, things and ways that you are becoming more involved, you will influence those around you by what you speak, how you speak of things, what you're reading, what you're learning, how you're engaging. Position yourself in places where that you recognize your influence, use your expertise and your talents, and take advantage of that. As you might in your work situations, you have different positions of power in your institutions. You have different privileges where you may be a part of organizations or organized committees, and you notice and recognize there are certain voices that are not being heard. There are certain viewpoints that are not being represented. So it's up to you to interrogate the systems that you're a part of and use the access that you have, the power and the privileges that you may have because you are in spaces where other identities may not be, and call those identities in or figure out ways to revamp processes so that it's more reflective of understanding the needs of others. These are all important ways that you affect change because it's not just the work that you do individually, but it's the ways that you are able to bring marginalized voices into the work, because ultimately any change that needs to affect, if we're going to change systemic problems, is that we need to have the voices of those that have been most harmed through systemic problems represented in how those solutions evolve.
It also means practicing good followership. So if you're anything like me, you've grown up being told that you have to develop your skills to be a good leader. And leadership is important, and we all teach leadership in our institutions. But in this case and in this work, sometimes the work demands good followership instead. And so good followership is characterized by active participation in the pursuit of larger goals. So in a lot of cases, that means working independently. It means being accountable for your actions, and it means taking ownership of tasks without being the person who has to be in charge. It means supporting those who are leading the charge. Sometimes it means supporting those who have the lived experience without having to take over, without having to direct other people, and without having to be centered in decision making or in actions that the group is taking. And then the last piece here is particularly for those of us who identify as allies in racial justice work. It's about moving from that ally identity to being an accomplice. So an ally will mostly engage in activism by standing with an individual or standing with a group in a marginalized community, sort of identifying in that space as an ally. But an accomplice is somebody who focuses on dismantling the structures that are serving to oppress. And so that work is directed by stakeholders in that marginalized group. Again, it's followership. But an accomplice is one who is actively invested and involved in the work, not just accompanying someone, but actually participating wholeheartedly in it. And that's the work that's going to affect transformative change. But remember that the goal here isn't to grow one strong tree. The goal is to grow a healthy forest. There isn't going to be some point where we're going to arrive at some magical number of trees. We're not going to look around and say, okay, that's enough. Racial justice is about transforming the whole social ecosystem to be just and to be righteous. And it's akin to replanting the whole forest in this case. So once we grow into trees, fully formed, fully developed trees, our job is to bear fruit and then plant more seeds. Because each time we go through this cycle as an individual or group, we gain more wisdom, we gain more power, we gain more capacity to transform our world for good. And ultimately, every single time we go through this process, and we may go through this process multiple times as individuals, we may go through this process hundreds of times as institutions, but always we are returning back to the beginning to say, it's time to plant more seeds.
So we hope you found this particular framework to be the beginning of more conversations. Again, it's our attempt to embrace that this particular process of how do I get more involved, where am I, how can I do more, is something that you grapple with constantly. Whether you may see or identify yourself as being in any one particular stage of from an acorn to a sapling to a tree is what's less important, because it is a constant cyclical process that we all are engaging in, how we can educate ourselves more, how we can become more engaged, and what more can we do to effect change over time. So you may be at various different stages at various different times of your life, depending on which identities matter, because this is an important model not just for racial injustice work, but for any social injustice work that you are involved in and how to engage more effectively. So we provided a QR code here that you can scan for the fuller paper that represents and discusses the ideas we've had today. And our roundtable for follow-up on this particular presentation is on Thursday evening, October 22nd. So please join us then for more discussion and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.